Anyway, so there's a structure in our nose that actually responds to pheromones, but as to whether people actually respond to them or not is another question. I have responded to pheromones in the past. I've had wives and girlfriends that responded to pheromones in the past, but I don't know that. Not everybody does, okay? Let's just put it that way. And when we're talking about arranged marriages, you're talking about a group of individuals that don't respond, or at least they don't pay attention to pheromones. So, you know. So who does and who doesn't? Well, it really all depends on. There's some people that would like to think that humans are beyond animals, so we don't respond to the same thing that animals respond to. But the reality is, I think, I have, and I'm not exactly sure what other people do. And I don't care. It's none of my business what you guys respond to. But at the same time, they do exist. We know they exist in humans. Allomones are chemical signals that are released by one species and affect a member of another species. This is a good example would be flowers, bees, and other insects are attracted to the pollen in the flower, and then they pick up the pollen and they go to another flower of the same species, and they will cross-pollinate. This is very important as far as grains are concerned. This is very important as far as corn is concerned. It's very important as far as soybeans are concerned. The cross-pollination is extremely important. It's the only way that we get apples to grow is by cross-pollination by bees. Yeah, so if we didn't have any bees, and this is a really serious situation in the United States right now because we seem to be losing all of our honeybees. They seem to be dying of strange fungal infections. And if they all go, what's going to happen? How are we going to cross-pollinate plants? And this is really a serious situation. They are suggesting that people create hives, beehives. They're trying to get, especially in the farming regions, like Iowa and Illinois and Indiana, Kansas, North Dakota. They're trying to get people to start hives so that they can not only grow honey, of course, but so that they can support the cross-pollination of plants. And of course, that's what allomones are all about. 10 general principles of hormone action. Hormones frequently act in a gradual fashion. Other chemicals, you inject somebody with epinephrine and they have an immediate reaction. But hormones don't always work that way. And hormones, well, we're going to talk about this in just a minute, but they react, it's not an all or nothing situation. Hormones, you can have a little bit of hormone and you'll get some kind of a reaction from that. But the reality is behavioral and physical responses occur only after weeks of treatment and may last for several days. The hormones, the reality is that hormones react in a gradual fashion. When hormones do alter behavior, they tend to act by changing the intensity and the probability of a behavior. They do not act as a switch. So you can get a little bit and you'll still have a reaction. You can get a lot and you'll have a bigger reaction. But as with the neurons either fire or they don't. They always have the same intensity of reaction. But hormones don't. Hormones are not a switch. It all depends on how much you get. When I was working in the laboratory, sometimes we had individuals that would come in with, they were overly anxious. And what they were trying to determine was, were they getting too much cortisol? Cortisol is the stress hormone. So the individuals would come in, and we'd have to draw their blood either at 8 o'clock or 4 o'clock, which are the peak times for cortisol. And what we were trying to determine, were they getting too much cortisol? Were their systems pumping out too much cortisol? And if, of course, if they were pumping out too much cortisol, they would have an extreme reaction to the cortisol. Anxiety was a problem that these individuals had. Panic attacks, they were having panic attacks. So what we were trying to do was determine if they were getting too much cortisol, if their adrenal glands were pumping out too much cortisol. which is a possibility. Maybe you have an individual that doesn't react properly to a stressful situation, if they don't react at all. Normally in a dangerous situation, those individuals won't react and they will die, because whatever the danger is will kill them. So you have to have some kind of a reaction. So as humans have evolved over the last 2 or 3 million years, we have started reacting, or we have either reacted properly to a dangerous situation or not. And if we didn't, we died, and we dropped out of the gene pool. So you can see how the proper reaction to a dangerous situation would be necessary for the individual to survive. Also, if they reacted, if they were on edge and they reacted too much to a dangerous situation, they probably didn't survive either. And that's the way we select who survives and who doesn't survive, the way that you react to a dangerous situation. Number 3, the quantities and types of hormones released are influenced by environmental as well as internal factors. High levels of testosterone cause aggressive behavior. The most aggressive individual wins an encounter and maintains their testosterone level, while the loser suffers a lowering of testosterone after the encounter. The winner is more likely to, we're talking about testosterone here, and testosterone is a sex hormone. So the individual that wins actually is more likely to reproduce, because he has a higher testosterone level. And because he has a higher testosterone level, the females of the species will react to him more positively. The one with a lower testosterone level, of course, is less likely to have sex. He's less likely for the women to react to him. Number 4, each hormone has multiple effects on different tissue, organs, and behavior. Conversely, a single type of behavior or physiological change can be affected by many different hormones. Number 5, hormones are produced in small amounts and are secreted in bursts. Pulsating patterns are sometimes crucial for small amounts of hormones to be effective because they are pulsating. So you're getting a blast every once in a great while, and that blast, of course, will create a reaction. You'll get some kind of a reaction from it. So hormones aren't produced in large amounts. If they were produced in large amounts, we'd get an adverse reaction to it, which may have something to do with why diabetes is diabetes. You're getting too much of a reaction. Individuals haven't evolved eating a lot of sugar, and so if they eat a lot of sugar, then they get this pulsating blast of insulin. Eventually, of course, the body becomes less sensitive to insulin because they're getting this constant pulsation of the diabetes, of the insulin, and because of that, they become less sensitive, and then they develop type 2 diabetes. So we may be dealing with whole populations of individuals who did not evolve eating sugar. So it may turn out that when the Europeans first came over here, since Europeans were consuming a lot of calories, more calories than anybody else, and they were consuming calories in the form of sugars and starches. Since that was taking place, and they came over here where there wasn't, you guys were getting most of your nutrition out of protein, out of red meats, not so much starches and sugars. Because of that, we have two groups of individuals that were evolving in different directions, and all of a sudden, this population was forced to eat the heavy starch, heavy sugar diet rather than the high protein diet. And because of that, of course, we're getting the adverse reaction that we're seeing today. It's not just in the native population, it's also in the Mexican American population. But then again, the Mexican American population has a large percentage of natives, of Indians, of indigenous peoples of the
I
Americas.
noticed like, see, my mother receives government foods from the tribe.
Sure,
Yeah.
commodities.
And I remember we used to get them when everything was canned or packaged. I noticed that this time around, we took over there to pick up our packages, and it was different. They had like it was more fresh fruits,
Ah, good.
frozen meat,
Right.
flour that has wheat with it, not bleached flour.
Oh, okay. That's
Uh,
interesting.
Yeah, but still the rest were canned.
A lot of canned tomatoes,
Yeah, stuff like that. Stuff they can mix in.
green beans.
Yes, stuff they can mix in. But I noticed the one that really struck me was they had fresh fruits and fresh frozen.
Well, if you think of fresh fruit, how long is an apple going to last? Well, apples actually last a long time. If they give you bananas, I mean, you better eat that banana today, or it's going to turn brown tomorrow. You can't put it in the refrigerator or it turns faster. That's kind of fascinating. Well, that's good. That's good that they've gotten a conscience and a brain, because they didn't used to. The Fort Belknap College is right next to the commodity store. So we got to watch people pulling their commodities out of there. There was never any fresh meat or fresh fruit coming out of there. It's all canned food. And cheese, everybody loves commodity cheese.
Oh yeah, it's like gold.
I haven't quite figured that one out yet. I had somebody that tried to sell me some. It's one of those, hey, I got some commodity cheese. If you got $10, I'll give it to you. It's one of those kind of deals. I'm thinking, is it that good that it's, but people swear by it, I guess. That must be what they live on up north.
I like commodity cheese.
There you go, see?
That's good.
Obviously, it's good stuff. Is it American cheese or cheddar cheese or?
Pasteurized.
So it's like Velveeta.
Close enough.
Close to Velveeta.
Okay. I can see it like. I'm sorry that I mentioned commodity cheese. I'll
We
try
had
to.
we had some packages out from Cedar City, Utah, that
Mhm.
came in. Some of the church groups came out and they were passing them out over in Chinle,
Mhm.
and they had some real nice peaches, apples, pears. Those peaches were nice and ripe.
Is that right?
Wow.
The pears were excellent.
Okay. Well, that was awfully nice of them. Now you're all going to convert to whatever their religion was. Makes sense. I don't think food will convert my religion. Make me change my religion. Number 6, levels of many hormones vary rhythmically throughout the day. Many hormonal systems are controlled by circadian clocks in the brain. I already mentioned cortisol, where you have a cortisol surge at 8 o'clock in the morning and 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It has something to do with our anthropologic past, to the extent that at 8 o'clock in the morning we have to, I don't know, run away from the lion or something, and at 4 o'clock is the time that we have to find someplace to hide. And this goes way, way back. I mean, it must go way, way back, because we found it in all populations of humans. So it doesn't really matter whether you live in Africa or the Americas or Asia or on the Arctic Circle, you still have the same cortisol surge. Another good example of this would be melatonin. Because of the sunlight that you experience during the day, your melatonin will build up so that you're tired as soon as the sun goes down. That's the thought anyway. And now, of course, we have artificial light, and which can induce people to go to, or can induce the melatonin, but it has to be the right kind of light. It has to be broad spectrum white light. It can't be yellow light. It can't be the incandescent light bulbs don't work. It has to be white light. So we build up melatonin during the day, and it's based on the circadian rhythm, the circadian clocks within our own minds. If in the wintertime, when there's not as much sunlight, people feel tired. And sometimes they interpret that being tired as depression. So some people will develop what we call seasonal affective disorder, or SAD, where they don't have enough light. So we treat them with white light, with broad spectrum light, and that seems to work.
Seasonal what?
I'm sorry? Seasonal affective disorder. And the reason, well, it's because they're not getting enough light.
Some
And-
people like in Seattle
Seattle, exactly.
and Washington and depressed people.
People in in Montana and northern Minnesota, they just don't get enough light. So these individuals will get depressed in the winter. When I was living in Montana, we were getting 6 hours of daylight. It started at like 9 o'clock in the morning, and by 4 o'clock the sun was going down. I mean, that far north, the sun's on the southern horizon, and it just stays on the southern horizon. You really don't see very much. So not only is it not a very direct light, but it's yellow. It's not white. In the summertime, the sun is actually white. The light that we get is actually white. But in the wintertime, it's yellow. It's even yellow here. Wait until the wintertime. Wait until December. Right around the winter solstice. Check out the sunshine. At 12 o'clock in the afternoon, it'll be yellow. But we don't even think about it because it's so gradual. We don't even think about it. Anyway, circadian clocks. I got really screwed up one year. We went down to South America in the summertime. And in the summertime, South America is in the winter. So we spent 6 weeks down there. We spent 6 weeks in South America in the wintertime in June and July. So we lost our whole summer. And people got depressed, they became sick because they hadn't had the right seasonal changes. Montana's very hot in the summertime. It's pretty hot. It's as hot up there as it is down here in the summertime. Over 100 degrees, a lot of days. Yeah, it's nasty. But since it has such a long winter, it's tundra. Well, not tundra. You get a lot of insects, and the insects come out, and they're vicious because they've got to breed like today. If they don't breed today, they're going to get frozen out tomorrow, and they may not be able to reproduce. So these guys are adamant. I mean, they're really violent insects. Anyway, not important. Circadian clocks. Number 7, hormones affect the metabolic process in most cells and induce long-term metabolic change through the buildup and the breakdown of carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. So it's hormones that allow you to allow your cells to function over a long period of time. Number 8, hormones interact. The effects of one hormone can be markedly changed by the actions of another hormone, and we're going to find that out in just a second when we start talking about the hormones, specifically the thyroid hormones. The chemical structure of a given hormone is similar in all vertebrates. The functions served across species can vary, of course. And this is one of the problems that we're having right now. I told you about the problem with the sperm count. With sperm counts going down, one of the reasons or one of the excuses that people are giving is that they're giving steroids to cows. So the more beef that we eat, the more hormones we're getting. Now, beef hormones are not the same as human hormones, but they're close. And so the question is, if we are, and chickens we're giving them hormones as well. So if we're eating too much chicken and too much beef, are we getting too much beef and foul hormones, and is it changing us? We're giving them growth hormones. So is that making humans that eat too much red meat that have been injected with growth hormones, does that mean that we're getting growth hormones and should we be bigger? Now, growth hormone is fine, except this is an animal hormone for one thing, and we may be having an adverse reaction to it. So they think that that may have something to do with this lowered sperm count. 60% in the last 50 years. Yeah, that's a really a huge dip. And we may get to the point where people aren't able to reproduce anymore because the sperm count's too low. Number 10, hormones can affect, and also females are starting to, menarche is starting a lot earlier. Menarche is where they start their period. They pick it up and then drop it. Stupid. A pin. Needle in a haystack. I found one. Okay, that's kind of exciting. Hormones can affect only cells that possess a receptor protein that recognizes the hormone and alters cell function. In different vertebrates, the same brain regions often possess the same hormone receptors, and for that reason, we are able to map where the hormones are going. What was I talking about? Females, and yeah, menarche is starting a lot earlier. Could that have something to do with the growth hormone that we're injecting into the chickens, into the cows? It's a possibility. Not only that, but the female, we're also injecting the cows with male hormones. So could it be masculinizing females? Could be interesting in the future to see how this turns out. Of course, I'm not going to see it. You guys are going to see it, but or maybe it won't even happen in your lifetimes. Maybe it will be the next generation that boys and girls look and start acting alike. Everybody's growing beards, whatever. It could happen. I mean, it's
Like in girls, like in ladies.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah, we're going to talk about that too. about women growing facial hair. As exciting as that is. Neurocommunication works somewhat like an old wire telephone or telegraph system, where you couldn't make a telephone call unless there was a telephone line going into an area. Telephones were attached to the wall, so everything was coming along that line. The message travels over fixed channels to precise destinations. The structure of the connections between neurons determines the transmission of information from one cell to another. I'm not really going to talk about telephones and how they've changed over time, but if you watch an old television show from the 70s and 80s, and it's about spies, they were able to communicate with satellites, and because of that they could make a telephone call anywhere, but nobody else could. Now, of course, everybody can. I could, if I wanted to, I could call somebody on my telephone and it would be bouncing off a satellite. But in the old days, the only people that could do that were military people. There were a couple different reasons why they were trying to control who could and who couldn't. One reason was because they couldn't limit who used what satellite. So they only allowed select individuals to use those satellites. And those were military targeting satellites, okay? GPS and GIS started as a targeting system. And now, of course, we've mapped the entire world, pretty much. But once upon a time, the GPS and GIS were targeting systems that only we had. And the reason we had it was because we had these satellites up in space, and we could bounce off information about where you were, and then we would triangulate with the satellite to tell exactly where we were. And we did that so that we could pinpoint our missiles, so that we could surgically take out select areas of Russia or wherever we were trying to aim. Why am I talking about this? Okay, so the messages travel over fixed channels to precise destinations. The structure of the connections between neurons determines the transmission of information from one cell to another. So it had to do with where the message was going. Okay, and it went on specific channels, and that's the way it works in your brain. Unless you have schizophrenia. Now remember, the brain is columnar. In other words, information is vertical. So it starts up here at the cerebral cortex and it goes down. And this is how we find memories. So if you're trying to remember who was the king of Spain in 1492, then that information is columnar. You're not going to get information about making a cherry pie. But if you're schizophrenic, instead of it being columnar, this is all screwed up. So they're getting information is starting up here on the cerebral cortex. It's coming down and then it's going horizontally. And because of that, they are getting information about making cherry pie when they start thinking about Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, who was the king during 1492 as King Ferdinand. But we don't have that problem because we're not schizophrenic. Our information is traveling vertically. Okay. Does that make sense? All right. Good. Okay. So, and that's the way these telephone lines used to work. You could only call certain places. However, if you were in the military, you could make a call just about anywhere, which was kind of exciting. And what would happen was that you were calling a satellite that was beaming down to someplace, to Muncie, Indiana, and then it was going through the regular telephone system. So you wouldn't get the long distance charges. But you were stealing it. I only did that a couple times. But there were people that used that system a lot. What did they call it? It was a special telephone system. And you could call any base anywhere. And then what they would do, they'd make a connection. They'd make the connection with the local telephone. So I could call, let's see, if I called Muncie, I'd have to call Fort Benning not Fort Benning. There was a fort in Indianapolis. I'd have to call that place, and then they would make a connection to Muncie. And that's the way it worked. And then the Air Force had to pay for it. But of course, it was a free system until you went onto the other grid. It's kind of odd. Endocrine communication works like a television broadcasting system. Hormones are broadcast in the blood, and any number of scattered receptors throughout the body receive the message and respond to it, just like a television. So when CBS or NBC or ABC, of course, now that we're using cable and all kinds of different structures, in the old days, they would just beam it out, and your television would pick it up, would grab it out of the sky. That's just the way it worked. Neural messages are very rapid and are measured in milliseconds. Hormonal messages are slow and are measured in seconds or even minutes. Most neural messages are all or none responses. Hormonal messages are analog. It's graded in strength by the amount of hormone that is released. And of course, sometimes the amount of hormone that is released has to be measured because sometimes it's not enough. It's not enough to, a good example would be TSH. TSH is a hormone released by the Pituitary Gland to tell your thyroid that it needs to metabolize food. If you're not getting enough TSH, then your metabolism will be slow, and it's called hypothyroidism. If it's putting out too much TSH, then all of a sudden your metabolism is very high, it's very rapid, and you can't gain weight. So if you've ever seen these tall, skinny guys, the guys that are 6'5" and weigh 140 pounds, one of their problems may be they're hyperthyroid, and their bodies just burn up. They can eat all day long, and their bodies just burn it right up. Okay, so it's analog. Neural responses are very often voluntary, while hormonal responses are not voluntary. Both systems store chemical transmitters for future release. Both systems are stimulated to respond by an outside source. Both systems are quite complex and maintain many different chemical transmitters. Some hormones used by the endocrine system are also produced by neurons and used as transmitters So there are some hormones that are actually neurotransmitters as well. Testosterone is a good one. Is also a neurotransmitter. Is that right? Epinephrine is another one. Is a neurotransmitter. Both systems use transmitters that have specific receptors at the receiving target cells that respond to the stimulation. Both systems may produce a second messenger response in the targeted cells that brings about 2 levels of changes at the same time, a second messenger system. And I'm going to show you an example of a second messenger system in a second, I think. There are 3 categories of hormones. There are protein hormones, amine hormones, and steroid hormones. It has to do with their chemical structure. The protein hormones are composed of strings of amino acids. So it's very complex, the protein hormones. The amine hormones are composed of a single amino acid, so they're relatively simple. And then the steroid hormones are composed of rings of interconnected rings of carbon atoms rather than amino acids. So the steroid hormones and the protein hormones are very complex, and the amine hormones are not. Now, examples of the amine hormones would be epinephrine, norepinephrine, the thyroid hormones, TSH, T3 and T4, and melatonin. Relatively simple structure. The steroid hormones are very complex. These are made up of carbon rings. It's all of the gonadal hormones, estrogen, progestins, and androgens, and then the steroids are also. They're also steroid hormones. Protein hormones are just about everything else. Okay. Strings of amino acids. So you can see how important amino acids are. We have to have amino acids in our system or our bodies don't function properly. So this is very important. And of course the structures are very important. The smaller the structure, the more rapid the response. So the amine hormones react very quickly, epinephrine, norepinephrine, the thyroid hormones, and melatonin. Hormones promote the proliferation, growth, and differentiation of cells. Thyroid hormones present at birth support brain development and growth. If we don't have thyroid hormones, we're going to talk about this. Then it causes a hypothyroidism at the beginning of birth. The brain hasn't developed properly, and it causes the individual to have a intellectual deficit. It used to be known as cretinism. I don't know if we're calling it that anymore. It's in your textbook, but I'm not sure if that means anything. Anyway. Hormones modulate cell activity. Gonadal hormones modulate the onset and the maintenance of secondary sexual characteristics with puberty. So that has to do with change of cell activity. So not only do your body changes during puberty. I mean, that's one of the reasons why there's such an extreme reaction. But your body changes. I mean, things grow. You start accumulating fat. You start accumulating muscle mass. All of this changes mainly because of the hormones, the gonadal hormones that have increased in your body. So if you're a male, you grow taller, you grow more muscular, you start growing hair in odd places, you start smelling differently. You start putting out body odor that you didn't before. You can tell when a little boy starts going through puberty because he starts stinking. And he has to bathe. And before, it didn't matter whether he bathed or not. The only thing you could smell on that kid was dirt. But as soon as he goes through puberty, wow, all of a sudden he starts smelling bad. And he's got to take a bath just to get rid of the stink. My son was so sensitive to it. He was so appalled by this odor he was putting off. He started bathing himself in cologne. So he smelled so strong. It was terrible. You couldn't get in a car with my kid because he smelled so strong. It was terrible. And of course, the same thing happens with females. They start growing breast tissue. Their shoulders will expand to some extent. Their waist will get smaller, their hips will get wider. All kinds of interesting things are happening, and they start growing hair in interesting places as well. Protein hormones and most amine hormones bind to receptor molecules on the surface of target cell membranes. This releases a second messenger in the cell because of the rapid process of protein binding. Protein and amine hormones tend to act rapidly. And of course that creates a second messenger. I'm going to, where is the second messenger? There it is. Let me click on this and see if it works. It's going to work. This is exciting.
Epinephrine is one of many hormones that is water-soluble, hydrophilic, and therefore unable to cross the hydrophobic plasma membranes of its target cells. Instead, it binds to receptor proteins located in the plasma membrane and does not enter the cell. When epinephrine binds to beta-adrenergic receptors on the liver cell, G proteins on the inner side of the cell membrane are activated. Each G protein is composed of 3 subunits, and the binding of epinephrine to its receptor protein causes one of the G protein subunits to dissociate from the other 2. The G protein subunit which dissociates from the others carries a GDP, which is replaced by GTP when the subunit is activated. The activated G protein subunit then diffuses within the plasma membrane until it encounters adenylyl cyclase, a membrane enzyme that is inactive until it interacts with the G protein subunit. When activated by the G protein subunit, adenylyl cyclase catalyzes the formation of cAMP from ATP. The cAMP formed at the inner surface of the membrane diffuses within the cytoplasm, where it binds to and activates protein kinase A, an enzyme that adds phosphate groups to specific cellular proteins. In liver cells, protein kinase A phosphorylates and thereby activates another enzyme called phosphorylase, which converts glycogen into glucose 6-phosphate. The glucose 6-phosphate is then converted to glucose. Through this multi-step mechanism, epinephrine causes the liver to secrete glucose into the blood during the fight or flight reaction.
The point is, and you don't have to remember what the hell they were talking about. The point is that you can see that what's going on. We've got one reaction taking place, and then it's creating all of these other reactions. And that's what the whole second messenger system is all about. That's what I wanted to show you. And so when we start talking about second messenger system, all we're talking about is one thing happens and then another thing happens. This is how blood pressure medicine usually works. It's a second messenger system. So it slows down the whole heartbeat and the whole process of blood circulation. And it does this by this second messenger system. And because of that, it's a slow, drawn-out process, just like what we just saw. A relatively slow, drawn-out process. Let's get out of here. It worked. It's this new one that makes it work. Okay. Hot dog. I'm so excited. Okay. So the first reaction is very rapid. The second reaction is much slower, and that's the second messenger system we were talking about. Steroid hormones must pass through the cell membrane and bind to specific receptor proteins inside the cell. The combined steroid receptor complex then binds to the DNA inside the nucleus. The effect of the gene expression may increase the production of some proteins and decrease others, and of course that has to do with the second messenger system. The first steroids, the rapid reaction has to do with the fight or flight response. The second system has to do with muscle growth. Muscle growth is not a rapid process, but of course the steroids will create a situation where the muscle mass can grow. Most of the hormonal systems in the endocrine system control themselves through a negative feedback system. A gland detects a need to produce the hormone is produced, the need is taken care of, the gland is no longer stimulated by the need, the gland produces only enough hormone to take care of the level of the need. And that's the way hormones work. It's just like the negative feedback system is like when you pump gas. You pump gas until your tank is full. And as soon as the tank is full, it indicates to the nozzle to shut off. And hopefully that happens. Doesn't always happen, but it almost always happens. And that's the way hormones work. Hormones will be produced until they're not needed anymore, and as soon as they detect the fact that they're not needed anymore, they shut off. It's a negative feedback loop. Insulin's negative feedback loop. Glucose from a meal enters the bloodstream. The increased glucose triggers the pancreas to produce more insulin. The insulin enables the cells of the body to utilize the glucose for energy. As the level of glucose in the blood decreases, the pancreas is stimulated to produce less and less insulin. A balance is maintained, of course. Now, of course, if you're diabetic, then this whole loop is skewed. Either the insulin, you don't produce insulin yourself, which is type 1 diabetes, or your cells have become less sensitive to insulin, in which case we have to give you a medication that makes your cells more sensitive to insulin. The problem is that type 2 diabetes, the metformin that we use to tell your cells that they need to utilize insulin, eventually, of course, you develop a tolerance to that to some extent. So type 2 diabetes sometimes can lead to other physical problems. And this is one of the reasons why you have to maintain, if you've got type 2 diabetes, you need to check your sugar a lot. Because eventually what's going to happen is your body potentially is going to become less sensitive to metformin or whatever medication you're taking. In which case you'll start accumulating glucose. I was talking to an individual the other day, he's got type 2 diabetes. He said, I checked my glucose this morning, it was 500. Well, that's 5 times normal. That's not good at all. That means that your body's not utilizing, your body's not making insulin for one thing, or potentially it's not utilizing the insulin that you have. So you need to go and get more medication. Well, he ran out last week, but every time he goes in to see the people at IHS, they make him an appointment for next week. So I told him, you need to go to the emergency room and tell them that your glucose is 500. If I had a 500 glucose, I'd be dead. Because I'm normal, I don't have diabetes. And a normal person cannot maintain a glucose of 500. It's just too high. It'll kill you. It would kill me, but of course, he's had diabetes for a while. Yeah, anyway, my mother had the same problem when she got older. My mother, my dad was dying of congestive heart failure, and my mother said, well, it's, what was it? It was Labor Day weekend. And she said, well, if he dies, it's going to be the doctor's fault. So instead of taking him to the emergency room and showing them that he's dying of congestive heart failure, he was supposed to have surgery right after Labor Day. But this was on Friday. Well, geez, they weren't going to do his surgery until Wednesday. He would have died. And she was just going to let him die. And whose fault would it have been? Well, it would have been their fault, but who cares? I mean, he's still dead, right? And then, so he had the surgery, and he lived for another 10 or 15 years. I know. And she was ready to let him croak right there on the spot. Crazy old bat. And she did the same thing with herself. She had heart problems. And the reason she had heart problems, she's 98 years old. My God. Well, she was 96 at the time. Anyway, she didn't want to go and see the doctor, even though her blood pressure was so low that sometimes she'd just pass out. And so I told her, Mom, you need to go and see the doctor. He needs to adjust your medicine. And she said, he saw me last week and he didn't say anything. It was one of those kind of deals. She was ready to let herself die. I don't know. Anyway, we forced her to go into the hospital. We took her to the emergency room. She wasn't happy. I got a brother that won't go into the emergency. He won't go to a hospital. And he was the one taking care of her, I know. So he would drop her off at the door, and then he would go park someplace. And they would have to come out and to talk to him, because he wouldn't go into the hospital. Crazy stuff. Pituitary gland rests in a depression of the skull directly behind the nasal cavity. It's in a depression, and it's also protected by bone. So it's not like you're going to lose your pituitary gland. Well, you could, I guess. Somebody stabbed you through the nostril, they could go up through your nasal cavity, and they go, well, it's pretty hard to get to. It really is pretty hard to get to. It's about the size of a pea. It's a really tiny little thing. The pituitary gland consists of two parts, the anterior pituitary. The part that's in front is constructed of glandular tissue, and the part in the back, the posterior pituitary, it's constructed of neural tissue. So you have neural tissue and glandular tissue. So the pituitary gland is actually two glands, as exciting as that is. The pituitary gland is connected to the hypothalamus by a thin piece of tissue called the pituitary stalk. Now this is also protected by bone, so you really don't have to worry about your hypothalamus snapping off from the pituitary gland. If it ever does, then you're dead. You might as well cash it in. But it's protected. The axons of the hypothalamus reach into the pituitary gland, but only in the posterior pituitary. The axons from the supraoptic nucleus and the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus stimulate the posterior pituitary gland to secrete oxytocin and arginine vasopressin. And I'm going to explain those two hormones in just a second. Because of the vascular structure of the posterior pituitary, both oxytocin and vasopressin are rapidly released into the bloodstream. Vasopressin is also known as antidiuretic hormone. This hormone helps conserve water by inhibiting the formation of urine in the kidneys. So if you're out in the desert, you're wandering around, and you don't have any water, yeah, it allows you not to sweat. It allows you not to accumulate or pull water out of your kidneys. So if you've ever been in a situation where you're working really, really hard, or you're outside in the heat, you potentially didn't urinate all day. I mean, potentially that could happen. If your vasopressin was working properly, then that's probably what happened. I've gone a couple days without urinating. In extreme circumstances, of course. It is stimulated by areas in the supraoptic and paraventricular nucleuses that detect thirst and water needs. And of course, if you don't need it, then it doesn't accumulate. The water will not be pulled out of your kidneys because you need it so desperately. Now the reality is you can only go for a couple days without drinking any water. After that, you're kind of SOL if you don't have any fluid to take in. It has to be one kind of fluid or another.
I have an uncle that just drinks like a lot.
He drinks a lot?
He drinks a lot, but doesn't intake any water. And so in that
It's
situation.
water and whatever you drink.
Oh, really?
Oh, sure.
Even in the drink.
I don't know what he's drinking. What is he drinking?
He drinks like little hard stuff, like Bacardi.
Oh, he's
hard
drinking.
stuff.
Okay. Yeah. Sure. If you've ever been around alcoholics, they drink. Yeah, they get their water from whatever.
Oh, don't you get the liquor?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
It's liquid. Yeah, they say 10 glasses of water a day. They don't really mean 10 glasses of water. They just mean 10 glasses of fluid. You just need to take in fluid. The problem with alcohol, of course, is that it's alcohol, and alcohol evaporates very rapidly. But of course, it was mixed with water. There's no, well, you can drink pure alcohol. Well, you really can because it burns your tongue. And there's not very much liquid in pure alcohol. But even the strongest liquor has some water in it, has some liquid in it. So, yeah. I mean, if you've got a kid that won't drink water, but they drink all the Gatorade in the world, that's fine. It doesn't really make any difference. It's just the liquid that you need to take in of one kind or another. I complain that my wife doesn't drink enough. She drinks tea, she drinks coffee in the morning. But then again, she doesn't do anything physical, so she's not really losing any water. But I keep telling her she needs to drink more liquid. I drink all day long. I mean, this is lemonade. And I'll drink 2 or 3 of these things a day. Can of Mountain Dew. Making myself thirst.
There's a question I want to ask about, what if, I know several cases on the RIS, and know some people that, where they're pregnant, they take insulin
Okay.
to adjust their diabetes, or
Okay.
would that affect on newborns they have?
As long as they're regulating their insulin properly. The reality is that the connection between the two, between the mother and the baby, is minimal. The baby is stealing all the nutrients from the mother. So as long as the mother maintains a healthy lifestyle, even if that includes the insulin, as long as she's not taking too much insulin, then the insulin's not going to cross the placental barrier. And the baby's he's just sucking the nutrients away from the mother. But the baby's going to get the baby's going to get their stuff first. So if there's any body that's depleted, it's going to be mom, not the baby.
I see.
Okay.
And then there's afterwards, I know there's some of them have troubles with, when they have like I think it's a type 2 that you're talking about.
Right.
They have like little pits or like sores that usually breaks out. And usually they can have a cyst or some.
They become-
They're really big.
Yeah.
So I've seen some of those ones, and it's like a hole inside their body.
Right. It causes a fistula.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, it's a fistula. Yeah, the problem with pregnancy is that it stresses out your body. So if you are a borderline diabetic, it will kick you into diabetes. Potentially after the pregnancy is over with, you'll go back to being borderline again. That's usually the way it works. It doesn't you will only be diabetic during your pregnancy. And those individuals, they usually suggest that they not have as many. The more babies they have, the more likely they're going to develop diabetes. So that's one of the things that they'll tell them. But it's the mother has to maintain the best nutrition she possibly can, because if she doesn't, she's going to suffer, not the baby. The baby will only suffer if the mother has a nutrition deficit for an extended length of time. There are certain circumstances that can cause the baby to suffer. If she drinks, of course, the alcohol crosses a placental barrier. If she takes drugs, it may cross a placental barrier, may affect the baby. So there are situations where the baby is affected by what the mother's doing. As long as she maintains a healthy lifestyle, usually the baby will be fine, because the baby's going to get if she's not taking her vitamins, her prenatal vitamins, she's not taking those prenatal vitamins. Well, she is. The baby's going to get what the baby wants. If there's a deficit, she's going to suffer from the deficit. So she's taking the vitamins because the baby's going to suck all the vitamins away from her, and she has to take those vitamins in order to maintain her own vitamin level. This is one of the reasons why women, when they're pregnant, they will want to eat really strange foods. Some women eat dirt when they're pregnant, and they usually is because they have an iron deficiency, and so they're trying to get the iron from the dirt, as strange as that may sound. Now, this doesn't happen very often, because today, of course, almost everybody's taking prenatal vitamins. But she's doing it for herself. The baby's going to get what the baby needs. It's going to suck all the calcium right out of her system if she's not taking any. They tell women to drink milk during their pregnancy, and that's so that they can get this excess amount of calcium, so that the baby won't suck any calcium away from themselves. European women of European descent, they have a problem processing calcium anyway. They're the ones that develop osteoporosis. Asian women also develop osteoporosis. So those individuals really need to drink milk during pregnancy. They need to take in calcium, some kind of a calcium supplement during the pregnancy, because otherwise they'll develop osteoporosis. As ugly as it is.
The proteins in the bones? Is that
I'm
what
sorry?
it is? The proteins in the bones?
Yeah, calcium.
Calcium.
Yeah. Yeah, in the German women, there's an old German saying that for every baby you have, you'll lose 3 teeth. But of course, teeth are made out of almost pure calcium, so that's what happens. The baby sucks the calcium right out of their teeth. So well, if you watch a movie from the 1920s or 1930s, a lot of times, of course, we hadn't figured this out by this time. So in places where it's cloudy a lot, like in Germany, the sun doesn't shine very often. And because the sun doesn't shine, they don't get that conversion of vitamin D from the sun. And so they really have a really serious problem with this, especially the women living in the northern portion of Germany, closer to the Baltic Sea. Yeah, they had a really serious problem with osteoporosis and losing teeth. So if you saw an older German woman, she wouldn't have any teeth because she'd had, 5 or 10 or 15 kids or whatever, and so she wouldn't have any teeth. If you remember watching, if you've ever seen Heidi with Shirley Temple, if you've ever seen that movie, she wants to get bread for this grandmother that lives down at the bottom of the hill because she doesn't have any teeth and she can't eat the hard bread. Brötchen, the German bread has a very hard covering on it, and she can't eat that, so she wants to get her white bread so that she can actually eat the bread. As funny as that is, there's a reason for everything, I guess. Anyway, okay, so we're talking about vasopressin. Oxytocin also is produced by the posterior pituitary. Oxytocin stimulates the contraction of the uterine wall that speeds up childbirth, but of course, if she's not pregnant, do you need oxytocin? Well, it's still there, and we're still producing it. Oxytocin also triggers the contraction of the cells in the mammary glands that allows the milk to be released from the breast. It takes it about 30 to 60 seconds, however. So what a mother will do, if you've ever breastfed, one of the things that happens is that a mother will start responding to the baby's cry of hunger. Now the baby can cry, and if it's not a hunger cry, then the mother won't respond to it, as bizarre as that is. How can I explain this? I was married to a lady that was breastfeeding, and this is what would happen. The baby would start crying, and I would go get the baby, and by the time I got back with the baby to give it to my wife, she would already have one of her breasts exposed. And sometimes it would be squirting milk because it was already, the milk had already dropped and she was ready to suckle. And she would swear at the kid because he was making a mess. The baby was making a mess. I know, my first wife. While oxytocin allows other animals to reproduce, in humans it mediates sexual arousal and affection response, and we're not exactly sure to what extent. Humans are a little bit different from other animals. The anterior pituitary is made up of glandular cells rather than neural cells, as the posterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary is controlled by releasing hormones produced in the hypothalamus and are transported to the anterior pituitary through a network of capillaries called the hypothalamic pituitary portal system. So it needs to tell the pituitary gland to release a select hormone, and these are known as releasing hormones. Okay. The neuroendocrine cells of the hypothalamus that produce the releasing hormones are controlled by two influences. They receive neural impulses from other parts of the hypothalamus that either inhibit or excite their releasing capacity. or circulating messages from other hormones directly affect them. So the hypothalamus needs to tell the pituitary gland to release select hormones. A good example of this is corticotropin-releasing hormone. Comes from the hypothalamus. It stimulates the pituitary gland to release adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH. The ACTH will enter the bloodstream, and it will go all the way down to the adrenal glands on top of your kidneys, and it will tell the adrenal gland to produce corticosteroids. So the CRH, the corticotropin-releasing hormone, is actually produced in the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus tells the pituitary gland to release ACTH. The ACTH will tell the adrenal gland to release corticosteroids. Okay? So the releasing hormone actually comes from the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is actually telling the pituitary gland what to do. We used to call the pituitary gland the master gland. We don't anymore, because we know that it's the hypothalamus that tells the pituitary gland what to do. Another example of that would be thyrotropin releasing hormone, the TRH, stimulates the pituitary gland to release TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, that stimulates the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormones. So the thyroid hormones are known as T3 and T4. And that
Chain
controls.
of command, huh?
Yeah,
You know,
exactly,
how
yeah.
it goes down to the bottom.
Yeah, we used to think that the pituitary gland was a general. Now we know that the hypothalamus is a general, and the pituitary gland is the colonel. Exactly. Prolactin-releasing peptide and prolactin-inhibiting factor are produced by the hypothalamus to control the amount of prolactin released from the pituitary gland. Prolactin controls lactation in women, and this is very important. Somatocrinin and somatostatin are produced by the hypothalamus to stimulate the pituitary gland to produce growth hormone, which controls bone growth. We all are a select height, and the reason we are that height, our DNA has told us that this is how tall we're supposed to be. While we were children, our bodies were releasing human growth hormone, HGH, and of course it was the hypothalamus that was telling the pituitary gland to release HGH or not release HGH. Now the question is how tall are you supposed to be? We could give somebody HGH and make them really, really big, really, really tall. Would that work? We have seen people that have too much somatocrinin, have released too much somatocrinin, therefore it induced the pituitary gland to produce too much HGH. How functional are these individuals? These giants.
They rarely move.
They can't move because, well, they have a difficult time being functional because they're bigger than they're supposed to be. We all move fairly well. I mean, you ride a bicycle, my goodness.
Yeah.
I jog, and I can do that. We don't know what Hope's doing. She's probably over there dancing. Yeah, exactly. we can do all of these things because we're the right height for what we are supposed to be. My family's short. I have a brother that's 5'10", and he's tall, but everybody else in the family is short. I have a sister that's only 5 feet tall. My daughter's only 4'11". But my daughter can do just about anything. She played basketball, she played volleyball, she ran track, she was really, really fast. She played softball, she played any sport, and she's really good at it. And the reason she's really good at it is because she's the right height for her musculature. Or her musculature is the right size for her height. So the reality is that the HGH, as long as it's released at the right level, then that's, as long as we're eating nutritious foods throughout our developmental years, we're going to be exactly the right height, and we're going to be a relatively functional individual. We wouldn't want to give somebody HGH, because if you gave them HGH, they may get larger than they're supposed to be, in which case now they've got all kinds of interesting problems. Their skeletal structure may be too big. Their musculature may not match with their skeletal structure, so they have joint problems, all kinds of interesting problems. So the reality is you don't want to give somebody HGH, especially while they're developing, because they may be taller than they're supposed to be. I had a doctor friend he was big, his wife was big, so he assumed that his son should be big. Well, his son wasn't growing as fast as he wanted him to. And since he was a doctor, he could give him whatever the hell he wanted to give him, and he did. He gave him HGH to make him grow faster, because he was being picked on at school because he was small. And then he had his growth spurt, and now he's a mess. Now he's a real mess, because he's bigger than he should be, than he's supposed to be. So he's not very functional. Physically, he's not very functional. That's just the way it works. I don't mind being 5'6". It's okay, because I run really, really fast. And even if I didn't run really, really fast, I can still bale hay, and I can still do whatever I need to do. I can still do physical things, even at age 70. Gonadotropin-releasing hormone is produced by the hypothalamus, which stimulates the pituitary gland to produce luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone. In the female, luteinizing hormone stimulates the release of ova from the ovaries and prepares the uterine wall for implantation. This allows the female to reproduce. She does this once a month. She does this once a month. Follicle-stimulating hormone stimulates secretion of estrogen and influences ova production. So the FSH stimulates the ova to be produced. The LH releases the ova, and it prepares the uterine wall for implantation. And this happens every month, and this has to do with the female period. The males also need luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone. The luteinizing hormone stimulates the testes to produce testosterone, making the individual masculine. It also produces testosterone, which gives the male his libido, gives him his sex drive. The FSH, the follicle-stimulating hormone, influences sperm production, allowing him to reproduce. So something's going on with FSH in modern males, and they're not producing nearly as many sperm as they were. Now this is really kind of an interesting problem, because we're talking about people not being able to reproduce, but most individuals don't have somebody doing their sperm count, usually. I've had a sperm count only because, well, I used to do them, so I was curious. But we were doing sperm counts on pilots because they were not able to produce male children, and so we were doing sperm counts on these guys, or they couldn't produce children at all. And it turned out that since they were flying jet airplanes and they were pulling Gs, 1G is what we are feeling right now. These guys were pulling 5, 6, 7 Gs. I know. So the gravity that was pulling down on these individuals was 7 times normal. And because of that, it changed the sperm production in their testicles. And then they couldn't reproduce. Or they weren't producing male sperm, as odd as that was. Anyway, they were pissed. So some of them actually jumped out of the airplane in order to produce male children. They stopped flying, in other words. Okay. And this happened a lot. So what would happen, these guys would be pilots, they'd be big, tough pilots. And they would fly for 5 or 10 years. And then and they'd be married, of course, and they'd be producing all these female children. And then they'd get out of the plane. And sometimes it worked. I mean, sometimes they would produce male offspring. But sometimes, they weren't producing any babies at all. These guys were almost sterile because of all the G's that they had pulled. And it really all depended on the airplane. I had a friend that flew the SR-71. The SR-71 was a Blackbird. It was a spy airplane. It flew supersonic speed. It was as fast as a rocket. It could fly around the Earth in less than 24 hours. It was a really fast airplane. And he was pulling lots of G's. He never had any babies. He got married the last year that I knew him, or the last year that I was on the same base as him. He never made any babies. And his wife was, I don't know, about 10 years younger than he was. But then again, he flew the Blackbird, and it was a very, very rapid airplane. And he's pulling tons of G's. Well, tons, that doesn't sound right. The adrenal glands are situated on top of each kidney. This is actually what they look like. Kidneys are really this dark, ugly color. It's like, they look like eggplants is what they look like. I mean, they're the same color as eggplants. I don't know if you've ever eaten kidneys. They taste like urine. I don't know why anybody would eat them, but some people are, I know. Oh, don't make that face. People eat kidneys all the time. Like the pituitary gland, the adrenal glands are divided into two portions. The adrenal cortex, which is the outside, sounds like it's in the middle, but it's on the outside. And the adrenal medulla, which is in the middle. Medulla, middle, okay. Cortex is on the outside. Cortex in this case means bark, outer covering. The adrenal medulla releases the amine hormones epinephrine and norepinephrine in response to the sympathetic nervous system. The adrenal cortex produces and secretes some of the steroid hormones, the adrenal corticoids. Glucocorticoids affect the metabolism of carbohydrates, and cortisol is an example of a glucocorticoid. And of course, the steroids come out of the middle. Oh, I'm sorry, the steroids come out of the outside of the adrenal gland, and the hormones come out of the middle. There you go. Norepinephrine and epinephrine. Why don't we, well, let's do one more. A second group of adrenal steroids is the mineral corticoids, which affect the ion concentration of sodium in the kidneys. Sodium, extremely important. You need to be able to do this in order to retain enough salt so that your body will have the right, salt water structure. Aldosterone affects the kidneys to reduce urine output and conserve sodium, thus also conserving water. So aldosterone is one of the corticosteroids. And we need to stop right here. We'll pick this up next time. Okay, I don't have time to do